Hi everyone, it's Dr. Jamie. I'm here to give another mini lecture on virginity in patriarchal culture, and particularly in the United States. So, normally, the lecture that I'm about to give, I kind of weave into other lectures about virginity. So, I have another lecture up that you can find linked in the comments about the role of virginity in the patriarchal nation state. And normally I would put this lecture here. However, today's lecture deals with a sensitive topic. So today we're going to be talking about the connections and the history of virginity and rape law in Western culture, with a particular emphasis on English common law and how that affects US law. And so statistically, I'm always very aware of the fact when I teach a women's studies class and I have an audience of students in front of me. Let's say the class is capped at 30, and just to make math simple, let's say that 24 of those 30 are women. Um, Statistically, I know that 6 of those people have experienced some form of sexual assault. So this conversation can be very triggering. And while it is important, I wanted to pull this out and put it into its own separate lecture because the United States doesn't have a great mental health infrastructure. For many of us, our mental health care is tied to the universities where we go to school. Certainly, my entire school career, my mental health was through my university. And if my university had closed down, I wouldn't have had recourse to other mental health help. I wouldn't have even known where to start looking to find it. For others of us, our mental health providers have switched to telehealth, and we may or may not be able to access them through phone or video conferencing, or maybe there's just a lot of other demands on your time. I know that many of us go home to families where we care for parents or grandparents, or we help care for younger siblings. So maybe it's just a time issue. But while this is important to understand, I wanted to pull it out and make it its own little lesson so that you only engage with it when you have mental health care to support you. So, today we're going to be talking about virginity and rape law and the connections between those things and why they're important. So, let's get started. One thing to know about me is I am pretty obviously a huge nerd, but in particular, I really love etymology, so the study of words and where they come from. I think it's because as a first generation student, I figured out very quickly that if I understood words and prefixes and suffixes, if I was ever in a situation with a new word and could break it down, I could kind of guess what it meant close enough that I wouldn't have to reveal that I didn't know it. I could kind of have a working definition. So I really love words and I love understanding where words come from. And it's worth talking a little bit about where the word rape comes from, because the understanding that we have of rape today, which is a particular form of sexual assault, is not always the way that that word was used. In fact, that is a fairly modern interpretation. And I would love if any linguists would hop into the comments and provide some more resources on when that transition happened. But the original word is actually raptus, which I believe is Latin, and it's a verb. So if you have ever heard the phrase rape and pillage, that actually gives us a really good hint at how the word was originally used. So to pillage something is it's to burn down a building or to rob, right? It's to kind of take or destroy resources that aren't yours. That's what to pillage means. And so the reason that there's the phrase rape and pillage isn't actually because of a historical connection between invading armies, taking resources, and committing sexual assault, although there is that historical connection. The actual connection there is that raptus, the word from which rape is derived, is a category of property crime. So originally this wasn't a category of crime that applied solely to people. So you could raptus a cow in the same way that you could pillage a cow, right? You could take one that wasn't yours. You could raptus a store. Rape or raptus wasn't specifically applied to people. So you're probably already seeing what the important connection is here, right? And that raptus, the root word of rape, is a category of property crime. And so the original conception of rape is actually as a property crime. So that has some big implications, right? The first implication there is that women are property. This is something that is pretty common in patriarchal cultures. We talked about this a little bit in our video about virginity and the patriarchal nation state. So, this idea that women are objects upon which the state is built, and men are people. So, this is an idea that is really present in Western history. So, to give you an example of this idea that women are objects, you can go all the way back to Aristotle, one of the founding fathers of Western theory and Western philosophy. And Aristotle actually has an interesting quote where he talks about women being failed men. So the kind of Aristotelian idea there is that the natural form of a person is the adult Greek male, right? That's what a person is. And a woman is very close to a person. It was a fetus that was almost a person but didn't quite make it, right? So women are not quite people. Men are people, women are not quite people. And it's really interesting because if you go through kind of the taxonomy of people in ancient Greek myth, what you have is you have men at the top. Well, okay, so you have like gods at the top, but you have men for mortals, right? And then you have women, and then you have children, and then you have slaves, and then you get into men animal hybrids. So then you have centaurs, right? And then you have animals. So that's kind of the Greek mythological conception of personhood, which is kind of interesting because in modern popular culture, in Harry Potter and in the Narnia stories, there's this idea that centaurs are kind of like these wise, noble beasts. And that's not in Greek mythology at all. In Greek mythology, centaurs, with the exception of Chiron, who trained Jason and the Argonauts, centaurs are these kind of like, they have some of the reason of men, but they're mostly ruled by like animal appetites. So they're violent and they have a lot of sex and they act without thinking. So in Greek mythology, to be a centaur is a bad thing. It's kind of the opposite of what you might know if you grew up with Harry Potter or Narnia, in which centaurs are kind of these wise creatures. Okay, so why do I bring that up? Not because I want you guys to know the mythological history of centaurs, although it's interesting and you should look it up. I bring that up solely to illustrate that in this kind of taxonomy of personhood in Greek thought at the time of Aristotle, people were men, particularly Greek men who owned land and property, right? So women and children and slaves weren't quite people in the same way that property owning men were. And this is a thought that persists through a lot of Western culture. And to be really fair, this is not just a thought in Western culture. So if you grew up in a culture where you read the Bible or where you read the Quran or where you read the Torah, then a thing that you might have noticed is one of the biblical rules for punishing a rape is to have the rapist marry the victim, right? And that seems really odd to me. I went to a very conservative Christian school growing up, and so we read the whole Bible, right? So we read Deuteronomy and Numbers and the places of all this biblical law, and then there's the story of Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. I'm pretty sure it's been a while. So Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, who is raped and then married off to her rapist. And so that, why does that make sense as a punishment? That seems like a horrible thing to do to a woman, to the victim of the crime, to like make them have to see their perpetrator every day. Well, it comes from this idea that women are property, right? And this actually brings us kind of to the next point here. So if women are property, and their value is in their chastity. And we talked a little bit about this in yesterday's video about the virgin whore dichotomy in popular culture. So if women's value is in their chastity and their in marriage and their virginity before marriage, then what rape is it is robbing someone of that value, right? So it's not a crime against a person because in this framework, women aren't considered people. Women instead are valuable objects which men trade for alliances. And so this all comes back to this idea that I bring up in every one of my videos, which is that the primary function of virginity is an economic function in patriarchal cultures. In patriarchal cultures, where men accrue power and status and pass it along to their sons, you want to make sure that your power and status are going to your son. And for most of human history, we didn't have DNA tests and we didn't have Maury Povich. And so the way to know that your son was truly yours was to punish women for having sex outside of marriage. So if a woman comes into a marriage a virgin, and if she never has the opportunity to have sex with someone other than her husband, then that man can rest assured that his sons and only his sons are getting his wealth, his power, his status, whatever it is he wants to pass on. So within that framework, women aren't people, they are objects, and their value lies in whether or not you can determine if your son is actually yours. And so you can probably already see where this is going, right? If this is the function of women as an object, then the most valuable object, right, is the object that hasn't been used, so to speak. So that would be the virgin. That's the most valuable object. That's the one where you know 100% that she's going to have your son. She's not going to have anybody else's. So your property is going to go to your descendants. And so that's great. And that is why in a lot of Western history of law, committing rape of a virgin was a more severe crime than committing rape of a married woman who hadn't had kids and committing rape of a married woman who had had kids. And I list those very specifically because those were actually differences in the law following a woman's value, right? So if you rape a virgin, then it calls into question whose son she's going to have. If you rape a woman who's married but has not yet had kids, she still has the potential for value because she could still produce authentic sons. So you're still taking some of her value from her husband. But if you rape a married woman who's had kids, her value is in essence used up, right? So her husband has already extracted that value through getting heirs from her or descendants. And so that was the least severe of rape and often came with the least punishment of the crime of raptus. So the most important thing to note in this taxonomy is that when women aren't considered people in a culture or in a law, then they don't have the rights of people. And that's where it starts to make a kind of sense. Okay, well, to go back to that biblical story of Jacob's daughter Dinah, who's raped and then married to her rapist, well, you took the value of my daughter, which was her virginity, so now just take the whole daughter, right? It's not about justice for the person, in the sense that the woman is a person. It's in this framework, the woman is not a person, she's an object who belongs to a person. And in the case of a virgin, that person is her father. And so if you take the value, aka the value of her chastity or her virginity, away, then you've ruined that object and you have to compensate the person to whom that object belongs. To put it in really crude terms, it is an ancient you break it, you buy it policy. And obviously horrible. So this was encoded in English common law, this idea that raptus was a crime committed on an object, a woman, that belonged to a person, either her father or her husband. And so you compensated the person from whom you had taken value, right? So you compensated the man for taking value away from the object, which was his wife or his daughter. So the thing is, when the founding fathers, and I use that term very intentionally, were making laws in the United States, when the colonies were formed and they were using laws, they used English common law. That made sense, right? They were English colonies, they were under English rule, they had English law. So they just kind of wholesale imported a lot of English common law. And one of those that they imported was this idea that in the case of rape, the rapist owed the husband or the father for the value he had taken in taking the sexual purity of daughter or wife and calling into question legitimacy of future sons. So it's all very well and good to say, okay, well, the ancient Greeks were fucked up in plenty of ways. All cultures are fucked up in plenty of ways. What do they have to do with us, right? And it's even fair to say, okay, well, English common law seems like it had some kind of fucked up parts, but like we kind of had a war about it, and it seems like we have our own law now. But the thing is, if you look at the media coverage, and even if you look at the judges' pronouncements and trial decisions of modern rape cases, this idea is so deeply embedded in our culture that even though it's not anymore a legal statute, right? Legally, women are persons in the United States, but we are often still treated as objects, particularly in the case of rape law. This is why when a woman dares to prosecute her rapist, we ask a lot of irrelevant questions, right? Was she drunk? Was she on any sort of substance? Had she had sex before? And it's that one that really gets to the heart of it. It's not irrelevant whether a woman has had sex before, right? What's relevant in a rape case is, was something taken from this person without consent, right? But when we ask, had she had sex before, the heart of that question is really, did she still have value? And it's still this deeply embedded patriarchal idea that women's value lies in their virginity and their reproductive capacity. And that if a woman has dared to challenge that by having sex outside of marriage, then she has already somehow capitulated to or been complicit in a loss of her own rights as a person, which when you lay it out logically is absurd. But that is the thing about values and ideology, is they are often not logical. They are felt. They are hard to articulate. Most people, if you ask them why they want to know if a rape victim was previously sexually active, probably couldn't articulate it for you. And most people, I like to think, don't have that lack of compassion, where they might say, well, she had sex before, so she deserved it. I don't think most people really are that way. I just think that in a patriarchal culture, these ideas are so deeply embedded and internalized that they pop up before we have a chance to analyze them. And if most people sat down and analyzed them, I think we would reject them. Although I could be being naive and hopeful. But when given a choice, it's always better to choose to believe in a better world, even if it's just for your own sanity. So it's why this is important, and why I feel that we have to talk about it even though it's not pleasant, is because this is something that is still very much with us. You can see it in the news coverage of rape cases. You can see it in the way that rapists and their victims are portrayed, right? So often, something like less than 2% of rape cases go to trial. And even when they go to trial, even when they are particularly heinous and they get national news coverage, often what's talked about is the young man's lost potential, not the young woman's, right? And we have these huge debates of should she have been at this party? Yeah, she's a person. She's allowed to go to parties, right? Should she have been drinking? Yeah, she's a person. Like, even if she was underage, if she was at a party where there was alcohol, a good portion of those underage people were drinking. We can't just prosecute her for behavior that the majority was engaging in, right? And it also comes back to this idea, this is where we start to see men drinking excuses their behavior, whereas women's drinking is a reason for things that are done to them. This is all tied up in this idea that women are objects for the use of men. And when you step out of that place, when you start to act like a person, you receive some cultural pushback from these deeply embedded and internalized patriarchal ideals. So, this is kind of a short lecture because this is, like I said, I normally work this into other lectures when talking about patriarchy and virginity. But I want to leave you with one more thing. I think I misspoke. I want to leave you with two more things. So, first of all, if you have ever wondered why, when abortion comes up and political candidates choose to make a statement on it, if you have ever wondered why Republican candidates, and if you look at the history of statements, it's overwhelmingly Republican candidates, choose to say things like, I believe in abortion if the woman was a virgin, or I believe in abortion if the woman was raped and a virgin, or I believe in abortion in the case of incest. What those qualifiers are really saying is that the person who is talking to you does not fully see women as human. They see them as property that belongs to a future husband. And so it's not that rape is a crime against the woman, because in that framework, she's not a person. It's that the rape is a crime against her future husband because it has deprived him of some of her value. It has deprived him of her first sexual experience, which is where most of her value is located, in her virginity. So that is a thing to know when you hear people talk about conditions on abortion as if it isn't healthcare for women, and it is. But say things like if she was a virgin and raped, or if it was incest, and essentially if she was raped, it's okay to have an abortion. That's not because they believe in that case it's traumatic for the woman to carry a fetus to term. That's because they believe it's unfair for her future husband to be responsible for a child that isn't his. And that's a really good hint when they say things like that, what their ideological framework is. Similarly, when people say things like, well, if we legalize marriage between same-sex partners, then we might as well what's next? Legalizing marriage between a man and a cow, legalizing marriage between a man and a horse. People have made this point that is a good hint that the people saying that don't see marriage as a partnership of equal persons. They see it as a consumer relationship between a man and an object, where marriage is a method of purchasing said object. So the very last point, I said I wanted to leave you with 2 points. The very last point I want to leave you with today is, I hope, a hopeful one, which is when you start to think critically about these things, you can learn a lot about the ideology of the people around you from how they talk. So for many of you who are about to be voting age or who are voting age, pay attention to the way that candidates talk about the things you care about. And if there's something that feels off, dig into that, because that might tell you a little something about their ideology and whether or not you can trust them on a range of issues. When you're around people and they're talking about their worldviews, pay attention and hold your friends to account. You know, if someone says something like, well, I only believe in abortion if she was raped and if she was a virgin, ask them why. Really, partly to hold them account, and because partly, again, I choose to believe the world is a fairly good place, and a lot of people have incorporated and internalized these patriarchal values that they get from all sorts of different places. Sometimes from their education, sometimes from their media, sometimes from their faith group. Certainly not all media, not all education, not all faith groups. But people get these ideas from all over and don't necessarily know why they have them or think them through to their logical conclusion. And so, if we want to make a better world, and I hope that we do, then one of the best things we can do is pay attention to the way that the people around us are speaking and ask them good questions. So that's all for this little video on the history of virginity and rape law. I hope that this has been helpful. I would love for some experts who study the evolution of Western legal thought or the history of rape law to hop into the comments with some more resources for us. This is a tangent to my work. It's not the main point, so I know a little bit about it, but I hope that what I've provided has been interesting and helpful. As always, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.